USCHO.com. This is the USCHO Game of the Week podcast from US College Hockey Online at USCHO.com. An in-depth look at this week's top college hockey matchup and a preview of the other big games.
Welcome to the USCHO Game of the Week podcast for Thursday, January 31st, 2019. I'm Ed Trefzger alongside Jim Connelly. Before we get into the Game of the Week, a reminder that this podcast is brought to you by the NCAA Frozen Four, April 11th and 13th at KeyBank Center in Buffalo. Visit ncaa.com/Frozen4. The Beanpot is a big deal every year in the Boston area, with Northeastern, Boston University, Boston College, and Harvard taking part. Our game of the week is Northeastern versus Boston University.
And we are joined now by the coach of the defending Beanpot champions, something that this hasn't been said in 30 years. Northeastern University defending Beanpot champs and their coach, Jim Madigan. That has to feel good to hear that one, Jimmy.
Jim, I agree with you, and we haven't heard those words in a long time. And I do remember them before, because I was a junior/senior on the last team that won 84 and 85 back-to-back for Northeastern. So it'd be nice to say that again next year. We know that we got our hands full, but I like the ring to it.
When you look at I don't even want to use the word struggles to get back and win a championship, but it just felt like a long time in a tournament that's only 4 teams. You finally get it. Now you are defending champions. Does it change the feeling at all, the approach at all? I assume the approach doesn't change, but the feeling as defending champions as opposed to maybe defending consolation game champion, that probably feels a little different.
No, absolutely. And, the feeling is, there's excitement because we were able to win last year. So we have, 3 classes of players who understand what you have to go through to win it, and the sacrifice and effort that goes with winning the Beanpot. And you're right. It's a team that's only 4 tournaments. It's a tournament with only 4 teams, yet it's so very difficult to win it because of the quality and the caliber of all the 4 teams every year. So, we're excited about the opportunity to defend. I think it's never easy to win the Beanpot, but it's nice that you won it, so you don't have to. You're not carrying 30 years or 29 years of past, lack of success, of 29 years of a previous lack of success. So that part of it is nice, but there's still the effort and the sacrifice and you still need it to beat. In this case, it's going to be the first game is against BU, a very good team who's had tremendous amount of success in this tournament. Maybe not the last 3 years, but they've been to the championship game the last 3 years. So we know it's going to be difficult.
Jim, we're obviously a national podcast. So for the unindoctrinated, explain, now that you've been a player, an assistant, and a head coach in a Beanpot and won in many different ways, what does this whole tournament mean, and why is the Beanpot so different from anything else that college hockey seems to have?
It's unique because it involves 4 schools that you can drive around the perimeter of our 4 campuses maybe in a half an hour. We all almost touch each other in so many ways. It's unique to Boston. It is an event in Boston, like the Boston Pops, like the Boston Marathon, like opening day at Fenway Park, like, hey, the first Sunday in February, it's called Patriot Super Bowl, right? I mean, that's become a new tradition here in the city. I think our national folks might not like that comment, but hey, the Beanpot is part of the Boston fabric, and then it's an athletic must. It's made up of 4 great programs, 4 great teams of players, but it's part of the alumni body, the administrations of the 4 schools, the student bodies that come out and support. Northeastern alums working with Harvard and BC and BU alums. Everyone has their own tradition of what they do with the Beanpot Monday, going up for dinner before the game. So it's been going on for 67 years, and it's on 2 consecutive Mondays in February where you're not competing against anything else. Now the Super Bowl has been rolled back where it's the Sunday before, but traditionally it's the only thing going on. So it has this cachet in the city of Boston, like those other events I just talked about. And that's what makes it special. and you want to. It's special to play in it. It's even that much more special to win it.
We're talking with Northeastern head coach Jim Madigan, and we had Ted Donato, Harvard's head coach, on our earlier podcast this week, and we just touched a little bit on the Beanpot there. But one thing we asked him was that with Northeastern, Harvard, Boston College, and Boston University, the last four champions, all four schools have won it in the last cycle of the Beanpot, basically. And that hadn't happened in a very long time. Does that maybe change the feel of this tournament within the city? Because as a kind of an inside observer, but still an outsider, it did feel like the Beanpot had gotten a little stale to some of the locals.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, the Beanpot was dominated by BU and BC up until when Harvard won it, in 17, and we won it in 18. And, for us, as we know, you just documented, it was 30 years. For Harvard, it was 24 years. So, when you look back over that period of time, the only two teams that shared it, and they both went for runs of 3, 4, 5 years at a time, and then the other one would win it. Then they'd go back and forth. So it needed to be refreshed, and it needed Harvard and Northeastern to do its part. And Harvard did it before us, and then we were able to do it last year. So I think it just provides more excitement, interest in the Beanpot, knowing that any team can win it. I can remember being involved as a player, as a coach, and throughout the whole decade of the 80s, and we all won it. Northeastern won 4, but BU won, BC, Harvard won, and that's when it was at its greatest, because each week, each Beanpot, the first Monday and the second Monday, you never knew who was going to win it, where it was very predictable up until 2 years ago. That was either going to be BU or BC.
We're talking with Jim Madigan, coach of Northeastern. In addition to the school pride and the emotional value of the Beanpot, these are a couple of important games for you as you look at the NCAA picture. How closely are you watching where things stand with the pairwise, and are your players really aware of how important every game is, whether it's in the league or not?
Our players know exactly the importance of every single game. We're not coaching to the pairwise, but they understand the significance. As coaches, we're in tune to it and following it daily. And we've had some swings, both good and bad. After a loss to Merrimack, we dropped 4 or 5 slots, and after beating Maine the weekend after, and winning 2 games, and then beating UMass, splitting with UMass, we saw ourselves spike, by going to 7 or 8, and then obviously this past weekend losing to, getting swept by Province, we dropped 4 or 5 slots. So we're well aware of it. Particularly last year, we got in, as in that large bid with a good seeding. I think it was 8 or 9, but in a good seeding. So our players and staff and team are well aware of it. And but saying that, we just got to go out and play our hockey, and if we take care of the process and play the game the right way, then we'll get the outcome both in the win, and the wins will take care of the pairwise.
I've got to ask you a little bit of an off-the-wall question. I was in Matthews Arena Thanksgiving weekend, and much to my disappointment, your new scoreboard wasn't up yet. Could you tell us a little bit about that huge scoreboard at Matthews?
Well, in our athletic director, Jeff Konya, was obviously the driving force behind it and has done a great job just to generate and drive, an enhanced fan experience at Matthews. And that's what the scoreboard does for us. And it creates, an excitement in the building. And, think of a scoreboard, it's bowed on the 2 sides that run almost a full length of the blue lines. It's 50 feet. And then, the width-wise, it runs probably about 15 feet. And it is clear. The pixels in it are like watching it's like sitting in front of your living room TV at home. And, the way our people, our operations people can move things around with the graphics and, the operational part of it, it's really exciting, and it's awesome to watch. And I've got to be careful on the bench that I don't get the camera on me too closely when I'm arguing a play, because they picks up, your words very well and your mouth very well. It's that clear. So I don't want my mom telling me I'm not using good language on TV. So, but it's a great enhancement to the building and great enhancement for our fan experience for men's ice hockey, women's ice hockey, and men's basketball.
We're talking with Jim Madigan, Northeastern's head coach, and I cannot believe that a man like with the name of Madigan would ever use inappropriate language. Jimmy, we talked a lot about the Beanpot.
Particularly coming from a good Catholic school, too. Jim,
right?
Talk about the Jesuits and the Bazillion brothers, the Catholic education.
We know what it's like in Boston, but no, obviously we've talked a lot about the Beanpot, and this Friday will be another game that cannot be overlooked. UMass Lowell coming in pretty red hot right now. They've been a team that you've had some great battles with in the recent years, whether in the tournament or not in the tournament regular season in Belfast. You've battled the teams everywhere in the last 5-6 years. This is a game that cannot get lost in the Beanpot hysteria that the players, as you mentioned, probably hyper-focused, have to not think about Monday. They have to think more about Friday.
Well, you're right. I mean, it's a big game for in league standings, obviously pairwise, and we know they're hot as a pistol coming in. I think they're undefeated in 6 or 7. And I have a lot of respect for Norm, Coach Bazin, and the program he's run. I mean, he was 5 years in a row in hockey's championship game and winning 3 of those 5 years in the tournament and so tournament success they've had. And you're right. We've played them in almost every venue. We played them in Fenway Park. We played them in Belfast. We played them at Matthews. We played them at I was going to say Tully. That's how far back I go.
Songus is good.
Go back to Songus Arena, and we played them in the Boston Garden. So we played them in 5 different venues, and all 5 have been close. The games this year were close, and overtime game, and it was a close. I think it was a 1-goal game or maybe a 2-goal game, but that resembled a 1-goal game. So we know it's going to be a battle. It's back in our building. We got to, we had a tough weekend last weekend. We got to get back on, on the winning side of the ledger, and yet they're coming in knowing that, hey, we're all jockeying for position in top 4 place in home ice, right? So there's like 6 or 7 teams right now jockeying for that home ice position. So it's a huge game, and for us, it's there's no thinking about Monday night. This is all about Friday night and what we need to do Friday to get 2 points.
Oh, Friday should be a great game. That is UMass Lowell at Northeastern, but the USCHO game of the week, it will be Boston University taking on the defending Beanpot champion Northeastern Huskies. That will be the late game on Monday, the early game, Harvard Boston College. We know that one starts at 5. We don't know when the Northeastern Northeastern BU game necessarily starts. I've seen them start anywhere between 8 and 10, if my memory serves me right, Jimmy. But listen, enjoy the week, enjoy the weekend, and then into Monday. It's such a great time to be in Boston and enjoy Boston sports.
Jim, I appreciate it. And it is. It's a wonderful event and venue. And if anyone is out there is going to be in the area, they might want to come in and take it in on the Monday night for both the 5 and 8 o'clock games.
Northeastern's Jim Madigan will be back with more of USCHO Game of the Week in just a moment after these words from our friends at the NCAA Frozen Four, April 11th and 13th at KeyBank Center in Buffalo.
Speed and precision, unrelenting power. This trophy is not given, it must be earned. The 2019 NCAA Frozen Four, April 11th and 13th at KeyBank Center in Buffalo.
With a shot. Saved by Morris. Takes the shot.
Visit ncaa.com/Frozen4 and get your tickets today.
This is the USCHO Game of the Week podcast from US College Hockey Online.
Welcome back to USCHO's Game of the Week podcast. I'm Ed Trefzger along with Jim Connelly. Well, we just had a chance to talk with Northeastern coach Jim Madigan. It's a big game for them in a couple of ways, as we mentioned, and also a big game for the Huskies on Friday against UMass Lowell.
Yeah, and I think that's always one of the most interesting dynamics about the Beanpot is that the teams that will play, for the most part, play a single game the weekend before and a single weekend in the between weekend. there was a point at which Harvard kind of didn't have the nice agreement from the ECAC, but they seem to have set up their schedule. So all 4 teams will play just one weekend game for the next 2 weeks, with the Beanpot, of course, kind of surrounding it. And this week for Northeastern, this is a game you just can't look past. The standings are important. The pairwise is important. And UMass Lowell is playing some very good hockey. So that'll be an interesting night. Northeastern, for the most part, has been very competitive with Lowell in recent years and has pulled up a few upsets along the way. So that's one thing that you really have to look at, is the fact that they have kind of, I don't want to say had Lowell's number, but especially at home, they've played very well against the Riverhawks.
With a couple losses last weekend to Providence, Northeastern finds itself at number 13 in the pairwise as we're recording this podcast. So these games are important for an all-important NCAA at-large bid. Now, certainly Northeastern is doing well in Hockey East and could continue some success, but that's sort of a tenuous place to be in the pairwise.
It is. It's the bubble. Anything I say from 12 to 20 is the bubble, and that bubble shrinks as you get closer to Selection Sunday. But it's truly the bubble, and that's one thing you really have to remember, is that every game can be kind of changing in the dynamic of the pairwise. We look at Arizona State last weekend. They lost on Friday night, and they went from 12 down to 16. They won on Saturday night. They went from 16 back up to 12. Who would have known that a 500 weekend would do that for them? But you have to think, if they had lost that second game, where would they be? They could be down at 20, and they'd be, really getting into some pairwise trouble. So it really is volatile pretty much until the weekend of the conference tournaments, at which point I feel like we have a pretty good idea. I think at that point it's down to about 65,000 different iterations of what can happen as we get to Friday night of conference tournament weekend. So once you get to that point, I feel like you have a better idea. But until then, boy, everybody can hang on pins and needles. And we remember last year's national championship team, Minnesota Duluth. They didn't play in their conference tournament and then finished .0001 ahead of the pairwise cut line. So that's one of those situations. You just never know how good you have to be.
Well, we'll come back to Arizona State, who you mentioned, but in the Big Ten, the big matchup is number 11 Notre Dame for the weekend at number 4 Ohio State. And the big deal there, you talk about pairwise, Notre Dame sitting even lower than Northeastern at number 14. If they want to get back to the Frozen Four, this is a big weekend for the Irish.
Yeah, it really is. And this is, obviously, it means a lot in terms of the pairwise. Obviously, these are the top 2 teams in the Big Ten right now. We've mentioned Ohio State with a little bit of a gap, but Notre Dame can really close that gap with 2 wins this weekend, or a win and a tie and a shootout win. All those possibilities of taking 5 out of 6 points. That would do a lot, and I think that anything positive for Notre Dame right now will move them up the pairwise. They're playing a very high team in the rankings, so that should be positive. But Ohio State, they're also looking at this weekend as, boy, we can just put away the Big Ten probably this weekend, or come very close to doing so, and then at that point we can really focus on the bigger picture at hand, which is the pairwise, and then you're not talking about getting into the tournament. Now you're talking about being a number 1 seed.
The Big Ten's out-of-conference record has slipped a little bit down the stretch, and that has bracketed all of those teams a little bit lower in the pairwise.
Yeah, it really has, and that's, we were talking about them as, having 4 top 10 teams earlier, and that's really changed quickly. And, but that's the dynamics of the pairwise, and we know that it's all about out-of-conference wins. And right now, besides Ohio State, nobody else in the top 10. Then you have to look at Notre Dame at 14. And I don't know if I'm missing anybody, but I believe that's it in the top 16. You're going to have a chance to maybe get an automatic qualifier if Ohio State or Notre Dame can't win the tournament. But otherwise, it starts to look like a very dire year for the Big Ten.
After having 3 teams in the Frozen Four last year.
Right. And that's another part of it. You're coming off the best year in conference history, and now just a weak second half has really pushed a lot of teams down. Not to mention the fact that there's been a true cannibalization that hurts you as well.
Well, let's turn to the ECAC. The big matchups between ranked teams happen on Friday night. Quinnipiac travels to New York State's North Country, where it's going to be about a bazillion below zero. And Cornell travels to Union. How about those two games?
Well, anywhere you go, anywhere in the North right now, even the Midwest, at that point, it's a pretty cold time. And that's an interesting dynamic to the whole travel. I'm wondering whether there might be games canceled in certain places this weekend because it's simply just too cold to play. I think as you get into New York State, I think we'll be okay by Friday. But, there's a lot of, you mentioned both of those games. I mean, tons on the line when you really look at the pairwise and some of these teams are kind of streaky. I think that is, you and I were talking before we got on the air tonight. The big story this year has just been how streaky teams have been. You've seen teams go on 7, 8, 9, 10 game unbeaten streaks, and then you see them drop 2, or you see them drop 3 or 4. And then you're wondering, where is the consistency? And that lack of consistency has made this really a hodgepodge as we're getting into the final 4 or 5 weeks of the regular season.
Well, let's turn to the NCHC. No matchups among ranked teams, but there are two series that I think I'd like to highlight. One, North Dakota, Denver, a split last weekend for the Fighting Hawks with St. Cloud State. And as we talked about in our weekend review podcast earlier this week, a little bit of controversy. Denver coming off some losses. This is a big weekend for both teams.
Yeah, I really look at, Denver as a team that had played very good hockey, and then they had a stumble. And North Dakota is a team that's had a lot of stumbles early, but they started to play better hockey. They've put themselves kind of back in the bubble situation. I think for Denver, it's a really huge weekend because if you can go into for North Dakota, it's a huge weekend because if you can go into Denver and take a couple of games or take 3 points out of the weekend, you're going to move up the pairwise pretty quickly. But for Denver, I think if you can get a sweep or get 3 points out of this, now you're solidifying your position, not only in the standings, which I think they're actually still pretty far down, but more importantly in the pairwise. And I think that is as important to every coach right now as where they might be in their conference.
Number 1, St. Cloud State has Miami coming in. It's do or die time. It's dire for Miami after the sweep last weekend. They sit at number 35 in the pairwise. They've pretty much got to win the NCHC tournament to get in.
Yeah, it's dire now. And, I saw them at Providence about three or 4 weeks ago, and I thought, boy, this is a team that has a lot of heart. They rallied from 3-1 down to earn a tie. And I'm saying, boy, this is a team I really like. I like the way they're playing, but everything has just kind of gone awry. And now they're, you're 4 games above 500 overall, and they're going to have to win out there, or maybe not win out in the regular season. But they're going to have to get to the conference finals and win the tournament. That's probably Miami's only way in. St. Cloud, on the other hand, they're as solid as you can get. They're as solid as a rock, even though they lost last Saturday night to North Dakota. That's a team that's in fine shape, and they're just trying to, at this point, close out the regular season title in the NCHC and more wins. If you can get 2 wins against Miami this weekend, that'll go a long way.
One other ECAC game I'm going to throw in before we get to the non-conference game. Princeton is at Clarkson on Saturday night, rematch of last year's league championship game.
Yeah, these are 2 teams that are at the opposite end of the spectrum, though. I think a lot of people expected more of Princeton. They haven't delivered, but they've also had a couple of upsets along the way. And Clarkson, they've played very well, and they had a loss at Harvard last week, but that's a good team. That's very close standings. You're talking at the top, Cornell, Yale, Clarkson, Harvard, Dartmouth, Quinnipiac, all those teams separated by 2 points. That's kind of crazy when you think about those standings.
Well, as we look at the lone non-conference series this weekend, it's Arizona State facing RIT. And I can tell you right now that it's going to be wind chills of about 15 to 20 below on Thursday as they are heading to the rink for practice if they have the opportunity. But what's more important for Arizona State is they're down to 6 regular season games, and at-large bid is all that they can play for.
Yeah, and they're in a really good position right now, but these next 2 weekends, 4 games against Atlantic hockey teams, 2 at RIT, 2 at home against American International, they're kind of must-wins, and you can pull 3 or 4 out of that, and then you got to see what you have to do the last week of the regular season against Minnesota. But if you're Arizona State right now, I don't care how cold it is. Maybe your bodies have adjusted if you're from Canada and you're now down in Arizona. Get back into Canadian weather because you're going to a very cold RIT campus. Find ways to adjust and win, because that is what they have to do at this point. They've got to start winning games, and these are the next 2 weekends. They're so critical.
They're giving out free student tickets on Friday at RIT, so they should have a packed and hostile crowd on whiteout night appropriately. Both AIC and RIT playing very well right now, and certainly not teams that Arizona State can take lightly.
No, for certain. And, knowing Greg Powers and what he's been able to do with this team this year, I don't think they've taken any opponents lightly. They've not put their best foot forward every night, but I think this is a team that has really understood that every weekend, every point, every game is pretty big.
Well, that'll do it for USCHO Game of the Week podcast for this week. For Jim Connelly, I'm Ed Trefzger, and we'll catch you next time.
This has been the USCHO Game of the Week podcast, a production of US College Hockey Online. Visit uscho.com/podcasts to listen or subscribe.